Thanks, Nate. It's great to see both new faces, right, meeting new people, and the returners. So somebody just mentioned sharpening the saw, right? It's what we're all doing here. So I've taught history for 13, going on 14 years. And even when I teach Latin and Greek, I'm often teaching historical authors who wrote history. So I find that I'm at an age now where rereading is a lot more fruitful. I no longer read when I was younger. I'll admit I read for vain reasons, to say that I had read it, to check a box. But I find when I go back to books that maybe had been a box-checking book for me the second or the third time, it really comes alive because I'm bringing so much more life experience to it. And I think that's often what we'll say the great books do for us. We come back to them and what seemed maybe dry as dust the first time comes to life. So that's the title of my talk, is usually The Dry Bones, Raising Dry Bones. Ezekiel's one of those books, obviously a collection of the greatest books ever that we call the sacred scriptures, but it has such odd images, right? Ezekiel's raising bones and they're getting flesh on them, or wheels within wheels, or winged animals that maybe represent the gospel writers. And so I want to encourage us and share some things that I've learned in the storytelling process, where I think it does a lot of what Ezekiel does, where maybe a lot of what we give in the classroom is going to bear fruit or rise up or take flesh much later in our students' lives than we might at first realize. We could, if we focus too much on the short term, feel like failures because of the things that didn't make it into their essays or what they didn't notice by the time the test came around. But I think with a greater or longer vision, we can tell better stories because of what it is that will plant in the stories, which is more than just the teaching to the test. I kind of think of storytelling in the history classroom as a bit like traveling. We can travel to check the box. I've been to Sicily. I've been on Mount Etna, right? And we have too much of that mentality of seeing it through the two-dimensional lens of the camera field, right? It brings everything flat, and we think and compare it to what we had thought we were going to see, and then we went and we saw, and we checked that box, we came, we saw, we conquered, right? But traveling too fast has the disadvantages of not allowing us to be changed. So perhaps the multum non multa, right? We want much, not many. Seeing more churches might not help us as much as just praying in this one church. Or seeing more museums may not help us as much as selecting the 10 or 15 most important pieces of art for us personally, from where we're coming from. And then we've tailored a trip or an experience to open ourselves up for greater change, to open ourselves up for contemplation and reflection, which can honestly be hard if you're trying to keep on a schedule and make your train and make your plane and make your automobile. And that's a moving walkway or a treadmill that we can get stuck on as teachers too. And so I think storytelling, really, closing the books, eyes up on me, students can have their notes out, but let's tell a story. Let me tell you what this was like. It takes the history that we often have to cover, which can sometimes be thousands of years, and it personalizes it. It makes it so that it doesn't just come alive, but it becomes more memorable. If we teach history too quickly, we can feel like Dante going through the Inferno or up the mountain of Purgatorio, and this is one of the epics that has the most characters of any literature that's ever been written. Maybe War and Peace has more, or maybe War and Peace has the same number. It was bewildering, and Dante doesn't always even recognize them. Sometimes he's got to hear from Virgil, sometimes the person has to tell their own story, but it's in that storytelling that then that soul becomes known, becomes recognized. And I think we're the Virgils in our own classrooms. It's our job to walk these famous men and women of ancient, medieval, or recent times across the stage of our classroom and to show them this is the teacher today. What are we going to learn from Caesar or the Wright brothers or Jan Sobieski or Father Junipero Serra, all of which are different stories I've prepared for this talk at different times. But the standard story advice that we get doesn't often help us tell a great story because the standard story advice is analytical. It tells us the parts of a story are plot, character, conflict, setting, and theme. But it's overwhelming. Where do you start? Do you start with theme? Where would your plot start? Are we trying to tell the whole life of Caesar or the whole life of Junipero Serra? And so I've always found that those tools weren't nearly as helpful for me to synthesize a good story, for me to tell a story that my students would find engaging and that I would hear about being talked in the hallways or showing up later on tests and quizzes or in oral presentations. And so I have a framework where I usually will limit myself, I can be verbose, to a note card. And I will put on the note card 5 things that I want to make sure I hit in my story. And most of the time, there'll be the details that I think I'd forget or misrepresent, dates, right, names, if I didn't write them down. But on the side of the note card, I write context, catalyst, climb, crux, and closure. And if I can hit those 5 things and remind myself in a sentence or 2 of each one, I have a much more coherent and much more exciting story that feels more like a 3-course meal to my students, where they walk out and they've been fed. They walk out and they enjoyed themselves while they were learning. So I'm going to tell 1 or 2 stories, depending on how much time I use up, showing this framework, and then I'll walk back through the framework to show how I prepared these for class. The nice thing is the framework is flexible enough, right, the dry bones, if you will, that you can flesh it in different ways at different times. So when I no longer teach a lot of sections of the same class, but this can also be really helpful for always tweaking and always working on teaching it differently. I stuck with the same, I know I'm going to give my students the same context, catalyst, climb, crux, and closure, but I may include new or different details, or I may have noticed something in the last conversation we had with the first period guys, and I'm going to share that with the 5th period. So hopefully, your mileage may vary, of course, but hopefully this is something that you can find flexible enough to use as a framework in your classroom. So one ancient person that we know a ton about, in large part because we hear from him, is Julius Caesar. We hear from him, he writes his Gallic Wars, he wrote his Civil Wars, but I often want to contextualize Julius Caesar as a person because he's been so talked about and he's so associated with the mythos of the Roman Empire that it can be hard to remember how human he was. And so the stories that I like to tell about Julius Caesar are actually where his near death or near failure experiences, because they bring him back down to earth and they remember that this wasn't something that was necessarily going to happen. It wasn't just Julius Caesar stood up and everything fell out of his way and fell into place. And so I like to look at, there's a few things that I'll do when I introduce Julius Caesar, but I'll say Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. That's often something we still remember for the rest of our lives. He was 51 years old. And 10 years before that, he had a reputation as almost a nobody. 10 years before that, he had not conquered all of Gaul. He had done one impressive thing in the province of Spain. And he had been elected Pontifex Maximus, which was a nice cush job that came with a house, made it harder to fall into such great debt that you lost your house. And Caesar had money problems for the whole first 40 years of his life. So when you tack up those things, you realize that in Spain, it makes sense that he wept at a statue of Alexander the Great, because he was now older than Alexander the Great and had accomplished nothing nearly like what he had wanted to. And obviously he's comparing himself to Alexander, so he wants that kind of glory. But by the time he crosses at 51, in the 10 years from 41 to 51, he had so great a reputation that crossing the Rubicon with 1 legion, about 6,000 men, makes Pompey run away. Pompey, who had said earlier, when people were worried, hey, this might happen, I can stamp my foot and raise legions out of the ground of Italy. Well, he didn't really stamp. He ran away. He abandoned all of Rome and all of Italy to Julius Caesar, who barely fights a battle all the way down to Rome and then walks into Rome and keeps his legion outside. But Pompey has run away. He's taken the Senate with him, and he's run away to give himself time to assemble an army. And so it's at this point that we have to realize Caesar now has a job to do, and the clock is ticking. He's got to catch Pompey, and he's got to catch Pompey with a large enough army to beat him. So the catalyst for this is that Pompey runs south while Caesar marches south. He runs south down the Italian boot to Brundisium, modern Brindisi, and goes over to Greece. And Pompey has all the advantages. He's taken all the boats with him. He tries to close the port at Brindisi, and he has a larger navy, a larger army, and a larger cavalry that are now camped in Greece waiting for Caesar. Caesar gets split up over the next few months, and he manages to get across to Greece with a couple legions, but Mark Antony, that famous Mark Antony, is stuck in Brindisi trying to get out because there's a naval blockade, essentially, that Pompey is already running to try to keep Caesar from reuniting all of his troops, all of which have come down into Italy now. And so this difficulty highlights another political step in Caesar's career, where when Caesar had served as consul the first time, about 10 years before this, he was so powerful as a consul in getting his way that normally there were two consuls, and you would name the year after the consuls. So you would call it the consul of Caesar and Bibulus. Well, Bibulus gets run out of town early on in the year. He actually, in a riot, gets stuff dumped on him and leaves Rome. And when you're not in Rome, it's very hard to do politics. So people joked for the rest of the year that that was the consulship of Julius and Caesar, right? His first name and his last name. So Bibulus, though, is now in charge of this navy that's keeping Caesar from accomplishing anything. Who would have more skin in the game at actually trying to be remembered in history than the guy who's already been overshadowed by the guy once? Well, that's Bibulus. Unfortunately, Bibulus is extremely successful for several months and then gets sick and dies. And that's the end of Bibulus. This is why we still talk about Julius Caesar and why Bibulus is sadly a footnote in history. The timing could not have been worse for Pompey's regime because now the naval blockade is utterly disorganized. Bibulus was a very competent commander and had kept essentially a wall across the Adriatic, and Antony can now pierce it, which he does almost immediately within a couple weeks of finding out of Bibulus' death. And Caesar's troops are reunited, and the battle is on. This battle is not one of the famous ones you've heard of. It's the Battle of Dyrrhachium. But it gets worse before it gets better. Though that lucky break is something that Caesar is good at pointing out to other people, that luck falls his way when it falls. And this isn't the first time he's pointed that out. The entire Gallic Wars often points out two things: the luck, or the will of the gods that Caesar has on his side, and Caesar's speed. And so as we prepare for this battle, we get that Caesar has to force Pompey to battle. He still has the disadvantage of Pompey has set up all of his supply lines. Pompey is now in a backyard that he had earlier in his career conquered and made connections in, and is now assembling basically every legion that's in the Eastern Mediterranean world is eventually going to converge with Pompey as their leader. And so the sooner Caesar acts, the better off he is. It's been almost a year, or over a year by the time this battle happens, since he crossed the Rubicon. That's how long these things take. But Caesar manages to not just meet with Pompey and have their camps are facing each other, but he actually surrounds Pompey's camp with a wall and builds another camp on the other side of Pompey so that Pompey can't get out. And this is not only something we've seen Caesar do before, but it's a tactic that the Gauls used against Caesar in the Gallic Wars. So he's willing to take from anybody's playbook to see what he can do. And Pompey has to fight at this point because Pompey has to fight his way out. The only way out is through walls and camps guarded by Caesar's legions. The downside is that though Caesar manages to run him off, Pompey manages to trap Caesar in a smaller skirmish so that Caesar is caught up in something and isn't able to lead the larger bulk of Pompey's forces that get out. And so in the Battle of Dyrrhachium, it's one of the few, and one we often don't talk about, because Caesar loses. Like by every measure, Pompey breaks out of the encampment that's surrounded and intelligently made sure that the leader was occupied in something that was, Caesar is fighting for his life basically because he's ambushed on a road. And if he can't get leader and legions together, it's much easier for Pompey to fight his way out. But this is where Caesar immediately notices Pompey's mistake. Pompey was fighting for his life too. Pompey just wanted out. He does not turn around and crush Caesar's forces as he could have. And so Caesar tells his men that night, most battles, right, will end with sunset, that if they had had a real general on their hands, they would have lost. But it's Caesar who takes advantage of, says to his troops at night, this is part of the Caesar in his own words. He says, "The setback we have sustained cannot be blamed on me. I gave an opportunity for battle on favorable ground." That is, I was surrounding him with the camp, and hopefully he was going to fall into that trap in the way we want it. "I even took possession of the enemy camp," because he gets to Pompey's camp. "I drove the enemy out. Through your fear or some mistake or some stroke of fate, the victory that was as good as in our grasp was lost. So it falls to you," he's talking to his soldiers, "to make an effort to repair the damage through your valor. If you do, you will turn our loss to gain, as happened at Gergovia." He mentions something his 10th Legion had the heroics of his 10th Legion fighting in Spain. So Caesar sends his baggage train ahead, breaks camp in the cover of darkness, and is gone by the morning, with Pompey not able to follow up on his victory. And so what we have here are a number of lessons. Well, one is that Caesar was on a knife's edge at least 2 or 3 times throughout this story of will it work or will it not work. The second is, obviously, armchair quarterbacking is always easier, right? But seeing it after the fact is always easier. But what advantages do you press? And what is worth the information that you know who is struggling more? Does Pompey think that Caesar's not running away and that Caesar has all the advantages? Why does Pompey think that? What made Pompey, probably the second greatest military mind of that century, second guess himself? And then the third is that Caesar handles setbacks knowing that they're just one more step or a necessary step on the journey. He knows when to fold, so to speak, strategically in order to get ahead. But Pompey's men and soldiers will grow more and more and more confident that they can obviously beat Caesar because of this skirmish, right? This battle, this victory is what sets them up for the defeat. And yet Caesar's defeat is what sets him up and what he uses to set his soldiers up for the final victory against Pompey further east in Greece at the Battle of Philippi. So that's one story. And hopefully, most of you could see the framework. I wasn't telling all of Caesar's life, but the context allowed me to pick a watershed moment and to say he has accomplished something. But it's okay if you're not 51 yet and you feel like you haven't yet accomplished much. That's okay. A lot of Caesar's career was ahead of him. But the other things are it allowed us to see his political highlights up to this moment and then see his military highlights as he's going to go forward from this moment, while also humanizing him. We then had the catalyst, which allowed us to bring in the main characters of his life: Pompey, Bibulus, Mark Antony. Right? We kept a limited cast, but we were able to see exactly where those guys fit in long before we're reading the play Julius Caesar and Antony's giving a speech over Caesar's body. Hopefully in the climb, we get enough traction to see exactly what difficulties he faces. What does he know? What does he not know? What is going to be difficult, good, or bad about this? And then the crux is, what are the stakes? What's at stake? Well, Pompey thinks his life. Caesar thinks, I want to live to fight another day, right? And then finally, the closure is a good way to turn the story back to our students and ask questions. Right? asking them questions before they can ask us questions can often show us a little bit more of what sank in, but it can also help us become better storytellers because we think, what did I miss? Right? What is a kid still confused about? And that's the more often we tell these stories and ask for that feedback, the better off they will get. The story changes every time I tell it. But I think I've got time for one more. So I'll tell a shorter story here about Junipero Serra, because I don't want you to think, and I'd never want my students to think, that the only history worth telling is military history, because it's obviously fun, interesting, the stakes are high, and it's sort of cheating when it's life and death, right? We're all a little bit more on the edge of our seats here. But with Junipero Serra, you get a very intelligent Franciscan living on beautiful islands in the Mediterranean Sea off the coast of Spain. Right? He's from Mallorca, has a position as a theology professor in the university and seminary there. It's a pretty nice life. He could live and die in that exact position, except that he has a burning desire to preach the gospel to those who have never heard it before. And so he volunteers to go to the New World. But it's the 1700s, and the New World, at least if we're talking New Spain, has been converted for a long time. There's universities that have already been founded in Mexico City. He arrives on the west coast of Mexico and serves faithfully for decades with the Mexicans and Spaniards who have already been Catholic for a long time. This is very similar to his posting in Mallorca, except now he doesn't have a university position and he's teaching and preaching to the regular people. It's almost like a demotion, right? He's a regular parish priest. But over the course of his travels, he travels to Mexico City, he goes up to what is now Texas, and he eventually ends up in Baja California around the exact same time that the Jesuits have been suppressed, and the Jesuits are being kicked out of both Baja and Alta California. And the next logical thing to do is the Jesuits actually meet with Junipero Serra and two of his confreres, and they basically hand off the reins. They're like, we're not allowed to be here anymore, and so here you go. Here's who we know, here's what we have. But we're only in Baja California. Alta California, which is more or less the border between San Diego and Tijuana, is untouched. We've never been there. We had plans to go there. I guess that's on you guys now. And so once again, at 50 years old, I think he was 50. I didn't write that down. At 50 years old, he's finally fulfilling what he had the burning passion to do that made him sign up almost 2 decades before this. And so he meets his first soul who has never heard the gospel, and he's 55. I found it in my notes. He's 55 years old when he meets his first soul that he can preach to who has never heard the gospel before. And the rest of the story we know is Junipero Serra walking the distance from San Diego to San Francisco several times throughout his life to found the following missions, are personally founded by Junipero Serra. Mission San Diego de Ocala, the modern-day city of San Diego. Mission San Carlos Borromeo, the modern Monterey Bay, Carmel, or Pebble Beach if you're a golfer. Yes, thank you, Junipero Serra. San Gabriel Archangel is at the top of Los Angeles. San Luis Obispo is at the bottom of the Bay Area. San Francisco de Asís is right in the middle of the city of San Francisco. San Juan Capistrano is at the heart of Orange County. And Santa Clara is exactly or at the heart of where Santa Clara is in the central California coast. And just those 8 of the 27 or 28 missions that end up being founded are the cause of, or really the catalyst for all of this, is the mission style of the Franciscans to create a place where people are physically fed, physically housed, but also spiritually fed and spiritually taken care of. And he was excited to work amongst the natives which he didn't call barbarians, which was the common term at the time in Spanish. In his letters, he consistently refers to them not as savages, not as wild Indians or barbarians, which would have been the three terms of choice for his contemporaries, but as Gentiles, and sometimes as infidels, right? So his change in language tells us or shows us this tension, highlighting the driving force behind some of the missionaries, and explains some of their interactions later with the military leadership, where the military leadership see themselves more as your standard colonizers coming in, extracting for the sake of the empire. But Junipero Serra is not there to extract. He is there to give. And these missions stand to this day as a testament of that exact thing. Now, eventually, right, the Spanish come out. But it's amazing to me that Junipero Serra founds the San Francisco mission. It's not the first one he founds, but the San Francisco mission is founded 5 days before the Declaration of Independence is signed. And that's a context as Americans that we rarely teach our students. We do not think Junipero Serra is dressed like a Franciscan. He might as well live in the 14th century, right? Like, you think that's where Franciscans belong. And yet, without any powdered wigs or heeled shoes, we have the same man on the opposite side of the continent bringing the gospel to San Francisco at almost the exact same moment that the founders, in what seems like a completely different context, a world away, are debating about exactly what freedom is and what freedom means. And so that is another story that hopefully it's easy to map, but we want to bring in enough of Junipero Serra's details to tell the story, to have a point, to have a place to land the plane. But we don't want to tell so much of it that we're bogged down in details. A few things that I'll just point out about what I have noticed about my own stories that has made them better. I tend to kill unnecessary characters. So it's really easy in a big history book or any of the podcasts I listen to or the tomes we follow to get a very complex story. But we want to keep the spotlight on 3 to 5 people if we can. If I were to tell that story better, I would actually include, and I only didn't because I forgot to put them in my notes, the names of Junipero Serra's right-hand men and the name of the young boy or the young man that the Jesuits hand off to him to be his personal aide. Those 3 are going to be key characters with him for the rest of his life, and the 2 of them will continue his work after him. So one is often too few a number of characters because we don't often see the stakes. We can't compare and contrast, or we can't see the power of the friendships that he had forged and what those did. Those 2 fellow Franciscans that he brings into Alta California with him had been with him since almost the very beginning of his arrival in Mexico. And so their friendship is 15, 20 years deep by the time they're preaching the gospel in Southern California. Another one is I always want to keep the what and the why closely connected. So this helps me filter my details. If I'm going to give a detail, one that didn't show up in the Junipero Serra story this time is that he had a leg injury from a mysterious wound, or a wound that may have been exacerbated, like an exacerbated mosquito bite, but people aren't quite sure. But either way, he walked with a limp. And the fact that he did almost all of his preaching and all of his trekking across Mexico, up to Texas, up and down California, with an injury, without complaint, it's almost always his converts who are asking him about it, is an impressive show of how committed he was to this vocation, is that even through injury, even through pain, he continued to walk and to preach. So that kind of a detail, dropping in that he has a leg injury, wouldn't normally matter, except that what it shows about his character. And I often have to draw that explicitly for my students, right? It might be more subtle or more artistic not to draw it, but for our students who are often still moving from the concrete mind to a mind of greater abstraction, we want to be sure to point that out if we want them to walk away with it. And then the last thing I recommend is that I'll let a story sit with the students for a day or two, but I'll have them tell the stories. And there's 2 ways you can have your students tell the stories. One is the sort of standard history test identification questions. So you give them 10 characters, all of whom you told stories about this semester, and say, pick 5 of them and write an identification. And in an identification, you want to almost do the same framework I gave, but I simplify it for my students and say, okay, you want to give me content, so who he is, what he did, context, a little bit of why it matters, or where he was coming from and what it led to, and significance. And so some of those IDs can be 3 sentences, and I'll tell my students, give it to me in 3 sentences. Some of them, if they're on a final or a midterm, I'll say make a little bit longer. But there's a few advantages here for you as the teacher, as well as for the students. For you as a teacher, you get to see which of the 10 names resonated most with my students. I told these 10 stories, but everybody picked these 3. All right, well, I'm doing pretty well with those stories. Maybe I should work on the other 7 and improve my storytelling there. Or you'll notice what details they include. And you think, wow, I talked about him in September, and people still remembered that he had that leg injury or something, right? You really start to see what resonates with your individual students. And another way of doing this can be in preparation for a larger test like this, where you put the names on the board and randomly select a student and say, hey, why don't you remind the class what we learned about when we talked about the Wright brothers or Junipero Serra. And that student basically has to come up, stand up, and talk, and you'll just say, I won't interrupt you, but try to remember everything you possibly can about this person. And I think the difference that I've noticed when I've done that from a reading versus when I've done that from storytelling is that it's often much more organized when I've told it from a story. Because a story has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and that beginning and middle and end were planted in them without me saying beginning, middle, and end. And when they're pulling it out of the textbook or the reading or whatever we've had them read, that's much, much harder for the young mind in particular to organize well and to organize coherently. But stories have a natural organization to them. So that I recommend this all the time, but that process of having your students come up and tell back something that they have learned from is called narration, and I have other talks that I've given on it. And my last thing would be to always be filling your tank. So I've read and listened to tons on Julius Caesar in particular, which is what in some ways makes that story harder to tell because I want to give all the details. But I haven't read as much on Junipero Serra, and it was so fun to go back down that rabbit hole and to look for more details about him and to really put together a picture of the man. And because these are biographically driven, often, it's not impossible to tell a story about an idea, but even if you get to an idea or an invention, we often get more excited about Thomas Edison than we do about the light bulb, as cool as the light bulb was. So I look for podcasts that tell good stories. I look for books that tell good stories. I look for talks that have good storytellers in them. And that is, I'm constantly feeding myself and then practicing those stories, both in my classroom and on my own podcast. So I would highly recommend that you start a podcast if you want to become a better storyteller, because it certainly helped me. My podcast is about Plutarch, and I go through each of Plutarch's lives, and I look to find ways to make it easier to read somebody who wrote 1900 years ago, and ways that you can get more takeaways that are clear, because reading something in a context that foreign and different from our own can sometimes seem dry and unfruitful. And there we're back to those dry bones, right? Because we're all working on becoming better storytellers, but it's an art much more than it's a science. And so I hope that this framework and some of these examples have really helped you bring something into your own classrooms and share something with your own students, because you'll see them come to life with some of these characters who will no longer be this dead person on a page. So thank you for your time.